Hey y'all, welcome and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nataya and this is Nesthetics, where I talk about topics that I care about and you should care about too if you choose. Today we are talking about Black love and trauma bonding through looking at The Color Purple and some of Bell Hooks' work. We are talking about how Black love and what we have perceived and believed to be Black love, is that really Black love, or has it really been trauma bonding? So I thought about this topic after watching The Color Purple some weeks back. This was my first time watching The Color Purple as an adult, like all the way through. As a child or as a teenager, I had seen The Color Purple, you know, in the background on BET, and I knew all the famous lines and things like that, but I had never really sat down and watched it as an adult to understand The Color Purple and the message behind The Color Purple. And for this video, we are going to be talking about solely the movie and not the book, just because I have not read the book in so long. So I'm going to be referring to the movie only in this video. And also, I started thinking about this topic after reading, well, I just started reading recently Bell Hooks' book Communion, The Female Search for Love. Here it is right here. I'm like on chapter 4 of the book, and I read all about love earlier this year, but after reading that book as well, it made me think about this topic. So first, I want to talk about The Color Purple and why this made me think about Black love and trauma bonding. If you have not seen the movie The Color Purple, I'm going to give a quick synopsis of the movie and about the main character, Celie. So The Color Purple, the movie was released in 1985, and it's set between the years 1910 to 1940. And the main character is Celie, who's played by Whoopi Goldberg. She experiences a lot of trauma by the hands of Black men in her life, and this film caused a lot of controversy between the Black community when it was released in 1985, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. So Celie, as a teenager, she gets raped by her father, who we later find out in the movie that was actually not her father but thought was her father. She got raped by him multiple times and had 2 kids by him, and every time she had those children, her father gave them away for adoption. And then as an adult, this same father gave her off to this man named Mr. for her to be married to him. Mr. originally wanted Celie's sister, wanted to marry her, but she was younger than Celie, so Celie's father gave Celie away to Mr. Mr. basically made Celie his mammy, his maid. She cleaned around the house, took care of him. He mistreated her a lot, abused her, everything, and she was there from like her, I want to say her early adult years. I don't even know if she was actually an adult when she got sent away with Mr., but let's say early adult years to like late adult years, she was with Mr., serving him, married to him. So Celie gets abused by Mr., and then one day she's finally fed up with it because Mr. had been keeping Celie away from her sister. And basically, Celie, she walks away from Mr., puts this little curse on him with her hand. She's like, until you do right by me, like everything in your life gonna fail, basically. She put a little curse on him. Celie went to go open her own clothing business. She was a seamstress. She inherited a house and she was able to live there. She started to live autonomously, freely, etc. So that's the basic synopsis of the movie. There's more that happens to the movie, you know, if you've seen it, but I just wanted to focus on Celie and what happened with her in regards to her relationships with Black men. So in The Color Purple, you see that Celie and her relationships with Black men were very terrible. So this caused a lot of controversy in the Black community, and a lot of Black men were like, is this how Black women view us? And some Black women were like, why are we portraying our Black men this way? And some Black women were like, I know women like Celie. So now I'm going to read an excerpt from this 1986 New York Times article, which explains some of the controversy that Black people were expressing during this time after the film came out. And the article is called Blacks in Heated Debate Over The Color Purple, and I'll leave the link to this article in the description box. I'm about to read a good chunk of this article, so just sit back and relax and listen. In living rooms, in taverns, on radio talk shows, in newspaper columns, and at community forums in many parts of the country, black men and black women are arguing about the movie's depiction of black men and its possible repercussions. Oprah Winfrey, who played Sophia in the movie, said, "This movie is not trying to represent the history of black people in this country any more than The Godfather was trying to represent the history of Italian Americans. In this case, it's one woman's story. No media vehicle since Roots has caused this kind of dialogue. Many black women defend the film, saying that it accurately reflects their own experience or the experience of women they know. Many black men and some black women contend that it gives a misleading picture of blacks in America and distorts their history. Many women say it is also their story." Ernest Thomas, a telephone company employee in Chicago, said she knew many Seeleys when she was growing up in Sunflower County, Mississippi. She, her mother, and her aunts were all beaten and otherwise brutalized by their husbands. Miss Thomas said the movie just lifted a burden. "The most frightening thing for me as a male was to look into their eyes," Mr. McDuffie said. "I wondered, is that really what they think of us? It's as if there were an element of cruelty implicit in black men that all black women seem to identify." Willis Edward, president of the Beverly Hills chapter of the NAACP, argued in an interview that the movie never showed the good about black men. Others argued that the movie distorts black history and appears to blame the victims of racism for a host of social problems, including a preponderance of broken families and a high incidence of teenage pregnancy. "Black men are perhaps no different from other men in their attitudes towards women," he said. But he added, "Lots of times we sweep our own problems under the rug under the justification of upholding black history and the black men." So that's an excerpt from the article, and you can read the whole article by clicking the link in the description box. But as you can see, black people were in debate about this movie, and of course I do not know the relationships about black men and women during that time period, and The Color Purple was set between 1910 and 1940. I don't think that The Color Purple represents, like, of course it does not represent all of black women's, especially during that time period, experiences with black men. But I do believe The Color Purple and Seeley's story is some women's story, unfortunately. Now, one thing that I do want to say is that we do have to look at societal factors during that time. And I remember in my African American Studies class, I was reading an article about how, like, the early 1900s and how black women were the main contributors for income in their household. And that was because black women were able to have more stable jobs and they were able to work more. A lot of black women were maids and they were servants for white families, so they always were able to get work more hours, make more money. Even though their wages were lower than black men, their incomes contributed more to the family household, whereas black men, even though they were making more wages, they were working less because they were in trades. So sometimes they would get laid off in the winter time and they would not work, and the black woman's income was the main income for the family. I also remember reading a lot of black men resorted to, like, alcohol and drinking, and I can just imagine how much pressure and the black man felt during that time. You know, men in general, they want to be, even today, protectors and providers, and for black men not being able to provide during that time and then resorting to drinking. And you know, these black families, they had a lot of kids back in the day. They would have like 6 to 10 kids. Like, back then it didn't matter if you know, one of y'all wasn't working, we still having these kids. And I just can't imagine how that would have impacted the black man and how that could have been a factor in why some black men were abusive or were mistreating their partners who were black women. This is not to excuse their abuse or excuse their mistreatment, but of course this argument is nuanced and there is more nuance to it. So we do have to look at the societal factors that would impact why black men would be abusive. We can't just say like, oh, black men were just abusive to black women because they dislike black women. we have to look at the situation more nuanced. And also, you know, during that time, 1910, Black people weren't that far removed from slavery, and that's a lot of trauma there. So just dealing with that trauma and all of that. So if I can find that article where I read about that in my African American Studies class, I will link it in the description. But yeah, so now we're going to get into trauma bonding. So trauma bonding, I'm going to read a definition from Psychology Today, because trauma bonding has different definitions, but the definition that I want to use for my argument today, I like the Psychology Today article and what they defined it as. So Psychology Today says a trauma bond is an attachment formed between two people who unconsciously bond to each other based on shared trauma. So I started thinking about how Black people, because they weren't so far removed from slavery, how were they pairing and marrying each other, not more so based on love, but based on trauma. Like, we have this shared trauma, we're coming out of slavery together, and we're trying to readjust and assimilate into the American life, get jobs, etc. And you know, a lot of arguments, especially from like Black men relationship I cannot talk. Okay, a lot of arguments from Black men relationship gurus. And I've heard Kevin Samuel say this before as well. They say like, oh, Black women don't stay in relationships like their grandmothers used to or great grandmothers used to. They didn't get divorces. They stayed in their marriages. They stayed in their relationships. They stayed beside their Black man.
Why don't you just become the women that your mother, your grandmother, and your great grandmother were? You know, the women that got married and kept men?
And it's like, were they staying in that relationship because I know everybody doesn't see marriage as love, you know, but I do believe that there should be love in marriage. So were they staying in those relationships because of love, or were they staying in those relationships because they were trauma bonds? Because the trauma was so fresh, I question how Black people were coping with their trauma during that time. And my theory, even though I have not read enough about this topic, my theory, I believe, is that Black families were coping through their trauma through religion and sex. They were having a lot of kids, and sex even today is like something that I see and hear about being a trauma release. A lot of people say like sex, money, drugs. I've heard that in like songs from rappers, especially like the PTSD song by G Herbo, which I did a breakdown of over a year ago at this point. But I remember Juice WRLD saying in that song, sex, drugs is how they deal with how Black people or how the community deals with their trauma. And I feel like during this time, sex was one of those things, because Black people were having so many kids. Like, Black families had like 10 kids, like I was saying, 6 to 10 kids, even though both of their wages weren't even that much, but they were figuring out how to make it work. And also with religion, Black people, you know, they were very religious or very spiritual. They believed in God. A part of that also was believing in staying married and not getting a divorce. Now, I do believe that religion and your faith is a way to cope with your trauma, but I do not believe that it's the only way you can cope with your trauma, especially with what Black people were going through during that time. I don't believe if you just solely use religion, only use your faith, that your trauma will subside. I believe you have to do more than that. And I'm not sure how Black families during that time were coping with their trauma, and I'm not sure if they knew of ways to cope with their trauma, because this was all like very new. Like, we're coming out of slavery, we're trying to readjust to society. People don't want us to work in certain type of jobs. They were giving Black people the worst jobs, the lowest paying jobs. So it's like this was all new to them. I think possibly Black people might have been, you know, conversing with each other, having conversations with each other, or journaling or things like that to cope with their trauma. That's my thoughts, but I'm not really sure how they were coping with their trauma. So that really makes me question, was this really Black love, or was it really a trauma bond? And now I want to get into bell hooks and what I've been reading in Communion. And in Communion, bell hooks talks about the marriages in her family, the marriages between her parents and the marriages between her grandparents. Now, Bell Hooks talks about how the marriage between her parents, her mom was very unhappy, and Bell Hooks asked her mom, like, why don't you leave your marriage? And she was like, no one would want me, I have kids. And she was kind of like somebody that didn't believe in divorce, and she was like, I'm just gonna stay here even though I am unhappy in this marriage. And then Bell Hooks also talked about her grandparents, how her grandparents lived in or slept in separate rooms, but they were married. And I was able to relate to this because my late grandparents, they slept in separate rooms, and they basically lived in separate houses. So the way that my grandparents' house is that, you know, it's one of those 2-story houses. It has 2 doors in the front. One door is to the downstairs, one door is to the upstairs, but they're both separate houses. My grandmother would live in the upstairs part, my grandfather lived in the downstairs part. And that, I believe, occurred for like at least 40 years of their marriage. And they were separated like that for, I want to say, 40 plus years, because they got married when they were like 19, early 20s, and then they passed away when they were in their 80s in their 80s. So they were living like that for a long time. And I know that my grandmother, there were times where she was unhappy in her marriage, but she did not believe in divorce. My grandmother, her and God, like, her relationship was with God. Nah, she didn't play about that. Like, you need to know anything about God, you can go to her. She was reading her Bible every day. She would sing her songs. Like, she did not believe in divorce. And as we know, like, our families knew that my granddad would get on my grandmother's nerves, and yes, she did still love him, but divorce was never an option, even if there were things like cheating going on, even if there was anything going on. And I don't know the whole details of their marriage, but I do know things have happened, and divorce was never an option for my grandmother. Never. So for dating gurus to say to black women, why aren't you like your grandmothers who stayed in their marriages and didn't get a divorce? It's like, our grandparents weren't even happy. Our grandmothers weren't even happy in their marriages. I believe that 2 people who are going to marry each other, they should be happy. And I know some people say marriage is a contract. Marriage is not about love. I believe there should be love within the marriage. So it's like, black women want to be happy. Women in general want to be happy in their marriages. And as women have gotten more rights and more financial freedom, being able to be more financially independent, just as we see in The Color Purple with Celie, how she was able to have her own business and sustain herself and live on her own. With black women gaining those rights, black women have chosen to leave if they're unhappy. And even if they look like the black sheep of the family because their mothers or their grandmothers didn't believe in divorce, they do it anyways because they do it for their own happiness. I think it's time, or I know it's time, for us to stop idealizing these black love marriages that were in the late 19th, early 20th century from our grandparents and great grandparents. In reality, we do not know the details of their relationships. We do not know why they stayed together, even though yes, they might have stayed together until death did them part, but we don't know if any abuse was going on. And I'm sure not every black marriage was abusive. Not every black marriage, not every black woman or man was unhappy. Like, we know that that's not all black marriages, but just to like kind of generalize like our grandmothers and talk about how they stayed in their marriages, like, we need to stop idealizing those relationships and thinking as them of black love, because we really don't know if they were black trauma bonds, as I keep saying. Like, because black people were going through so much trauma during that time, and then black women didn't have the freedom to, they didn't feel comfortable leaving their marriages because of religion, and then not having the freedom to be financially free if they were to get a divorce, and still having to take care of kids, etc. It seems like that in combination with trauma is what actually kept those black marriages together. So what we have thought to be black love, and like, oh, I want to love like my grandparents and I want to stay together like they did, that's not really black love. It was most likely a trauma bond. It was most likely a trauma bond. Instead, we should think about black healthy relationships that we see present day and stop idealizing these relationships of our grandparents, because like everybody always says, we are not our ancestors, so we gonna do better than our ancestors. And not to say that all of our ancestors, all of our grandmothers, that they were unhappy in their relationships, or even granddads, if they were unhappy in their relationships, but we know that some of them were. And some of those relationships that black dating gurus are praising and saying that black women today need to be like them were actually black trauma bonds and toxic relationships. So that gets me into black love today and how we think about black love today. And I don't know if it was the pandemic or what, but the black like dating market and the relationship between black men and women, I think also social media just contributes to it as well. We just see a lot of hate and negativity from both sides. Black men talking negatively or down about black women, and vice versa, black women talking down and negatively about black men. We see that so much. It seems like it's so much tension in the black community, especially in regards to dating. And I don't know what the future is for black relationships, romantic relationships in particular, but I sure do hope that it gets better. I really do. And even like me, I'm going to an event soon, like next week, and it's about black men and black women coming together. Like, it's supposed to be like a healing conversation to talk about how black men and black women, we can work together like in our relationships, whether they're romantic, platonic, familial, etc., how we can understand each other. So I'm really excited about going to that event next week to just have a conversation with black men and women about how we can do better together, how we can heal together and understand each other. And I do think that present day, that black love and black relationships, they don't necessarily have to be trauma bonds. I do believe that black people, we mate and we come together because in romantic relationships because we have a shared experience of being black. And a lot of black people who express that they want a black partner is because they want that experience where their partner understands who they are as a black person. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a trauma bond. And even though we do have like a shared trauma and we do relate to each other on a shared trauma, I believe today it's not about coming together, sharing each other's trauma and bonding over each other's trauma, but learning how we can heal together and heal from this multi-generational trauma that exists within black communities. And also, even though we do come together based on shared experiences of being black, a black woman and a black man, our experiences are still different. A black man doesn't know how it feels to be a black woman, and a black woman doesn't know how it feels to be a black man. So our experiences are still very different, but we are still able to understand each other from our shared experience of being black in general. And of course, black trauma bonds do still exist in some relationships, and you know, there just has to be, we can't come together off of shared trauma. We have to come together with the intention of healing and the intention of spreading generational healing within our family lines. So that's all my thoughts about this topic. Possibly after I finish the Bell Hooks book, I might do another video on black love more in depth, but these are just my thoughts right now because I'm only on like chapter 4 of the Bell Hooks book. But there is a video by FD Signifier who goes in depth about black love, and he also has a lot of other good videos. So if you want to learn more about black love, I definitely recommend that video. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts on my thoughts in the comment section below, and I will see y'all in my next video. Bye.